Hi, everybody. Welcome to Shasai Podcast, conversations between scholars from around the world who study childhood, youth, and related institutions historically. As an official production of the Society for the History of Children and Youth, you can subscribe to these shows through iTunes or Google Play. Written and visual materials associated with each episode are available at our website, shcy.org. Enjoy.
Hello, I'm Catherine Sloan, an early career historian of childhood and youth at Hertford College, the University of Oxford, and I'm here with Laura Tisdall. Laura, do you want to introduce yourself?
Of course. So I'm Laura Tisdall. I am a New Act Fellow in History at Newcastle University.
So we're going to be talking about Laura's book, Progressive Education, How Childhood Changed in Mid-20th Century English and Welsh Schools, which was published by Manchester University Press in 2020. So Laura, do you want to give a kind of brief or introduction to the book?
Absolutely. So I would say the major argument of this book is that there was a major shift in how people thought about both childhood and adolescence in English and Welsh schools after the Second World War, particularly in the 1950s onwards. And I basically argue this was due to the increasing influence of what some contemporary commentators called progressive and some called child-centered education in English and Welsh schools. I focus really just on the state system. I focus just on primary schools and secondary modern schools. Of course, grammar schools are part of the state system in England and Wales in this period, but I don't look at grammar schools and I don't look at private schools. So I'm really looking at the schools that educated the majority of English and Welsh children in this period. And I argue that basically child-centered education is linked to developmental psychology. It's linked to the kind of popularized version of developmental psychology that's about what we should expect children of different ages, chronological ages, to be able to do, to be able to understand, and what they should be interested in. So child-centered education is supposed to be about tailoring education more closely to the needs of the individual child, but actually in practice in schools, and particularly within the working conditions of schools in this period where you've got very big classes and like poor facilities, and it actually means that teachers are often relying on stereotypes of what children are like at different chronological ages. And so I argue this actually leads to more limiting concepts of childhood and adolescence, that actually less is expected of children and young people in this period. And also the difference between children and young people on the one hand and adults on the other is widening. There's a sort of bigger gulf that children and young people have to cross before they reach adulthood.
That's really fascinating about the idea there are these merging ideas of childhood and youth in the period. Is there a particular reason why you were drawn to studying children and youth? Did you start out as a project about childhood and youth?
Yes, so my undergraduate dissertation was on Dr. Bernardo's homes in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I don't think I chose that project because I was particularly interested in childhood and youth. I think I was interested in the institutional care and the institutions of Dr. Bernardo's home, which obviously provided residential care for both boys and girls in this period in England. And then I went on to do a master's dissertation sort of on, again, children in care, but more broadly thinking about other organizations, not just Dr. Bernardo's. And I got really fascinated with how these institutions constructed childhood because they're such closed worlds, and how often actually they're drawing on older ideas of childhood, so they're often out of step with more current ideas of childhood. So I was focusing on an earlier period. I was looking really at the late 19th and interwar periods rather than the period covered by progressive education. So I got really interested in I guess as an undergraduate, it was the first time I'd realized that childhood is a constructed category, that it changes throughout time, that it isn't a kind of absolute, that people think about childhood has changed, and that really interested me. And so I really got into that. And so I think that's where my interest in childhood and youth came from, and that ultimately developed into my PhD, which is where this book came from.
So do you think the schools at the time, sort of compared especially with Dr. Bernardo, which you said had kind of out-of-date ideas about childhood, do you think the schools at the time that you're looking at had specific ideas of childhood, and what exactly were those?
Yeah, so I think the reason I focused on schools for my PhD rather than the sort of children's homes and institutions I've been looking at earlier is because actually this is how you get at what the majority of children are experiencing rather than a smaller minority and a stigmatized minority of children in care and also children in the juvenile justice system. Because obviously the majority of children of school age spend the majority of their time at school. Their waking hours at school. So that's where actually they experience much of their childhood and adolescence. And yeah, I think schools are places where new ideas of childhood and adolescence are being shaped in this period. These novel ideas of childhood and adolescence start to take shape in the interwar period in England and Wales, but I think come to practical sort of use in schools really from the 40s and 50s, partly as a new generation of teachers move into the schools who've been trained in newer methods and newer child-centered ideas. But as I argue in the book, I say it's kind of a half-reformed education that often teachers misunderstand these new ideas of childhood, these new psychological ideas, or more often adapt them for their own purposes. So as I was saying, if you're in a practical teaching situation where you have 40 kids, you know, you can't offer an individualized child-centered education. So you take what you need and what seems useful to you as a teacher and you discard the rest. And often that leads to kind of broad sweeping generalizations about certain chronological age groups rather than actually thinking about what individual children are interested in or like or are engaged with. Yeah, so I think they are very much engaging with these new ideas, but they're also reshaped within the school. They're not just dropped top down onto teachers. They're very much shaping them, reconstructing them.
And so you mentioned chronological age, and this is like a big factor in your book about the kind of really tightly bound chronological developmental model of childhood. So is there much of a difference between how children, like the primary school age children, are conceptualized in this period, in this kind of mid-20th century period, and how young people, what are the kind of age boundaries and differences and kind of categories being created?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'll just really quickly summarize the argument about chronological age more clearly for people who haven't read the book. Basically, I argue that chronological age becomes much more important in the school system in England and Wales in this period, partly because it's the first time that schools are really organized strictly by chronological age, at least schools for like working class children anyway. So there's a real move towards grouping children by age rather than grade or standard in this period after 1945. And that becomes more standardized across elementary schools in England and Wales, whereas before that wasn't necessarily the case everywhere. So children are grouped by chronological age clearly for the first time. And this is tied into new ideas about how to educate children, which are drawn from the developmental psychology of theorists like Jean Piaget, who obviously very famously talks about the different cognitive capacities that children acquire as they get older. So one really crucial thing in the book is I'm not arguing that Piaget's ideas were actually adopted, like they're misunderstood and kind of simplified, because of course Piaget doesn't necessarily tie certain capacities to chronological age. He talks about developmental age, but it's much easier for the layperson to understand if you talk about 8-year-olds rather than someone with the cognitive capacity of an 8-year-old. So they are simplifying Piaget's ideas and tying them to chronological age. So yes, yeah, there's this inheritance of developmental psychology, but it's also expressed very practically in the school system. And I've now forgotten the actual question that you asked. Oh yeah, different children and adolescents.
That's it.
Yeah, I think there are two things. So in one sense, they are treated very differently because obviously the whole thrust of child-centered education and these divisions by sort of finer and finer chronological age grades is to suggest that yes, there's a big difference in how you should educate children and how you should educate adolescents. That's expressed in the 1944 Education Act in England and Wales, which told local authorities that they had to set up separate secondary education for teenagers. So before that, the school leaving age was 14, but most often, if you were a working class child, you'd be educated in an all-age elementary school. So, until you left school, you'd be with all the other kids from 5 to 14. So the Education Act of 1944 only raises the school leaving age by one year. So it's not a huge expansion of secondary education in that sense, but the crucial thing is separate. So the idea that adolescents should be educated separately from younger children because they have different needs. So definitely, the kinds of psychological ideas I talk about in my book that are associated with, I look mostly at older primary school children from 7 to 11. I don't really look at very young children. I think there's a different history there that's more tied into psychoanalysis, so I won't speak to that. But 7 to 11-year-olds, there's this sense this is the period of middle childhood. It's the age of the gang. It's the age of children being naturally gregarious, naturally confident, naturally talkative, naturally wanting to be very constructive and practical, having interests that are very much related to themselves and their own surroundings. So the idea that the child is still egocentric, which is a term that Piaget used, which gets increasingly misused over this period to refer more to like egotistic, like selfish, rather than egocentric, which strictly just means focused on the self. So yeah, there is this very clear stereotype of the primary age child that emerges, and you can absolutely see the way this filters into actual educational practice and the kinds of work and activities that primary school children are taking part in. But at the same time, it is a limiting stereotype because it suggests that primary school children can't look beyond themselves or their immediate surroundings. And secondly, because obviously if you're not gregarious, if you're not confident, if you're not talkative, if you're shy, if you're quiet, it's another set of expectations imposed on children. It's supposed to be freeing because it's supposed to get away from the children are seen and not heard, children are quiet and orderly. That was perhaps more dominant in interwar classrooms. But it's still restrictive, I would say, in a different way. It restricts a different kind of child. Then with adolescence, you still get the sense that adolescents are naturally social, that the peer group obviously is crucially important to them, but there's more recognition of the fact that adolescents can also be solitary and need time alone and are struggling. And obviously there's the older ideas of adolescence as an age of storm and stress that go back to G. Stanley Hall, his work Adolescence, published in 1904. So they are very clearly distinguished as age stages, but in some ways I do also argue in the book that if you're a non-academic adolescent, if you're a working class adolescent in a secondary modern school, for example, some of the limiting ideas that are applied to the primary school child never really go away because you're seeing, it's like they never get past the cognitive stage that belongs to the primary school. The way that they're written about in educational texts at the time, unlike grammar school children or private school children, it's like they're always cognitively limited. They can never get to the stage of abstract reasoning, which is what Piaget thought was the sort of top of the stages of cognitive development. So in a way, although they're very different, they're also in some senses the same. There's still in the education of the sort of secondary modern school adolescent, there's still the same focus on immediate interests, vocational education, the history of the local area, like taking them to visit like places they might work, and it's becomes very gendered. So girls will go to shops and boys will go to the steelworks in Sheffield, for example. So there are clear differences between the age stages, but there are also these continuities, I would say.
Yeah, I find that really one of the kind of interesting things is that obviously it's like your work shows that age is a very salient marker of identity at this time, but that sometimes it becomes less important than other things like class. It kind of switches on and off or changes order in its level of importance. Which I guess interests me because I think sometimes as historians we can overdefine, I guess, the effects of age and group children together as a mass without thinking of those other finer kind of distinguishing characteristics. I think that's something that kind of from this book that really made me think about kind of those categories of age. I was wondering, is there anything else you think that you took away as a historian from doing this work about what childhood is and what youth is, or that you think helps us as historians to think about children and youths?
I think it made me realise at least in England and Wales and in Western countries, you have this kind of institutional school system, just how constitutive being at school is to childhood and youth existing as a category, particularly childhood, but also adolescence, at least in the modern period that I work on, at least in the sort of 20th century, that actually we think so naturally in chronological age stages that it seems to us to be really weird, the idea that schools might ever not have been organised by age group, but actually that is still relatively new. And we think that way our whole lives because we've all had at least if you've grown up in a Western country in this kind of school system, you've all had that experience of being in these sort of very tidy slices by age. And so I think that is hugely important for our experience, but I didn't think I realized that at the start of the project. Like, I thought, oh, schools, because that's where all the children go, that's where children are, but I didn't realize like how important they are in forming our ideas about chronological age.
Yeah, and as you make the point in the book, it's really interesting how little overlap there is between histories of education and histories of childhood. Like, they work in two completely separate silos. So kind of moving on to talk about the book a bit more specifically. So the title is A Progressive Education, ? How Childhood Changed in Mid-20th Century English and Welsh Schools. So Laura, I'd like to kind of discuss just first of all the title, A Progressive Education with a ? Because it's actually quite a radical thing, I think, in British history of education to put that question mark. Could you talk a little bit more about what it is you're questioning here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think traditional educational histories of the progressive or child-centered movement in England and Wales, or perhaps even in Britain in this period, have basically argued that there is this kind of uplift of radical ideas about childhood and education in the 60s and 70s, and then there's a backlash from the 70s into the 80s by, I guess, right-wing educationalists and right-wing neoliberal government who do not want this kind of freedom and creativity in schools, and who impose things like the national curriculum in 1988, which standardise what schools are doing, what teachers can teach, and removes this kind of ability, this freedom. In part of that, of course, is true. Certainly schools and teachers do have an awful lot more control over education before 1988. There's much less centralised control of the curriculum. But I argue, I guess, firstly, this narrative, first is this sense that you sort of have these trendy lefty teachers and then the right-wing government, and the right-wing government oppresses and squashes the teachers, and that also hurts children who are also being benefited by this freedom in education in schools. And one big thing I argue in the book is that teachers are never necessarily on board with this. Like, often teachers actually find it coercive that they're being forced to adopt certain child-centered ideas and practices. They actually see it as a threat to their professional identity as teachers. They define teaching as craft knowledge, as something that you learn as you do it, and that you get better at as you do more of it. And actually, they experience child-centered innovation not necessarily as like freeing, but actually as a sort of set of theoretical knowledge that's being forced upon them. Which doesn't mean they don't do it, because obviously I argue that they do to an extent incorporate child-centered practice, but it's not always enthusiastically, and sometimes this leads to it being kind of half-hearted, as I discuss in the book. But then the other thing is questioning, I guess, the word progressive, which is, as Emily Robinson's work points out, is a really contested word that changes its meaning in different contexts also across the course of the 20th century. It's also possibly particularly confusing for any American listeners or historians. Obviously, the progressive era in America is different from how we use progressive in perhaps the context of Britain. But yeah, I suggest that, what do we mean by a progressive education? Is it actually progressive for children and young people? And I guess I question, so I don't suggest that it's totally negative, but I guess I question how far this actually promotes the real freedom of young people to choose what they do in school and how they learn, and how far actually it's just the installation of another set of ideas made by adults about how children and young people should learn, what they should be doing. It's a different set of ideas, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it suits everyone better. And it also, as I suggested, brings along a kind of set of limiting concepts of childhood and adolescence that don't promote the autonomy of children and young people. And it's internally very contradictory, because child-centered educationists often say that they want to promote freedom for young people, they want to give the individual child autonomy, but they still prescribe what children should be interested in and what they should be doing in school. So that's one sort of problem I get into in the book. Like, is it progressive? Often people also mix it up, I think, with the permissive shift. So they say it's progressive and it's permissive, and progressive is just not the same as permissive. I don't think there is a permissive shift towards children and young people in schools in this period anyway, because children and young people do not have greater control of their education in this period than they did before, really. There were a couple of innovations very late in the period, like school councils, but as the the NUSS, the National Union of School Students, say, who emerged in the 70s, they say, well, actually, school councils are just tokenistic. We don't actually have any power. We just are there, and they claim they're involving us, but they're not. And the same way, in all the, for this book, I read an awful lot of teaching guides and research studies and books on child-centered education. It's very, very, very unusual for child-centered educationists in this period to ever have done any research or have asked young people what they want to do at school. It's all top down and based on perhaps observation of young people, perhaps work with young people, but not actually asking them directly or involving them. So there's no role for them in constructing child-centered education.
It's really fascinating about the idea that kind of creating this idea of the child where the child is completely not involved, but still feeling very deeply that it is child-centered, because it is so deeply contradictory, but I guess is so commonplace we can't see that contradiction. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit for anyone who's more international about how the British education system was organized at the time, because one of the things that your book does really well is it looks at kind of state provided education, which is often really marginalized in our history of education. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and about how education was structured and what you were looking at.
Yeah, I apologize for international listeners. I'm sure I've already used terms that are unfamiliar to you. It is, I must say, even British people, I think, really struggle to understand our education system. It is very confusing. In the period that I look at, the book obviously covers the interwar period as well, but I guess for the purposes of this, I'll focus really on our post-war education system, which is set up to a degree by the 1944 Education Act. As I've said, this empowered local authorities and quite required local authorities to provide separate secondary education. It didn't tell them they had to do this, but most local authorities did in practice adopt either a bipartite or a tripartite system. So they either provided grammars in secondary modern schools. So one set of state schools, grammar schools, meant for the highest ability students, often admitted through the 11 plus, which they would take at the end of primary school, a test that would assign them to grammar schools, and then the rest of the students would be in the secondary modern schools. So they would be for the rest of the kids. Some local authorities also had technical schools, which is the third leg of the tripartite system, meant for those who had skill, and particularly in sort of like practical craft related things. But in reality, there were not very many technical schools in England and Wales in this period. So most kids would not have been in technical school. So I focus on secondary modern schools. It's where about 75% of kids went, although it really varies by local authority. And there are more kids, for example, in grammar schools in Wales, because Wales had more grammar schools. But then also during this period, just to make it even more complicated, obviously, a lot of local authorities go comprehensive. So they combine their grammar and secondary modern schools and have all state educated kids in one school. And then obviously we also have a private education system for those who pay for their education, but I don't talk about that in the book at all. So yeah, I'm really looking at kids in secondary modern schools and kids in comprehensive schools, and of course kids also in primary schools, like elementary schools, so schools for kids younger than the age of 11. And I think this is part of the problem with the history of education. It is so difficult just to get to grips with the jargon and the kind of systems that we have. And I think that's one reason actually why the history of education, at least in Britain, has become so separate from other histories, because people just find it very confusing and difficult.
That's certainly true. And I'm wondering, because certainly from I look at 19th century education, and it's really hard to escape the kind of public school mythos. So the myth of elite schools like Eton and the girls' versions like Cheltenham Ladies College as the kind of origin of what an education should be. And that history is kind of very, very elite focused and very centered on sort of like, well, if we understand what's happening here, we'll understand everything. And I was wondering, like, does that crop up in the reception to this book? Does that crop up at all as kind of a point of discussion when people are reacting to your book? Do people ask you about the grammar school?
Yes. It's really interesting what you say. I'm just thinking of what you said, because I'm wondering if that's because people think that it's only worthwhile looking at the education of children if those children went on to do something important. And most of the children I look at don't go on to do anything important, so hence they're not important. and it's this suggestion that childhood is only valuable insofar as it shapes adulthood. So that's why else would you write a history of childhood? And obviously I don't agree with that. I think childhood is important in its own right, regardless of what the young people go on to do. And I know you've said similar in talks that I've heard you give. But yeah, when I tell people what I work on, the most common question I get is, were grammar schools a good thing? So that always comes up, and I don't even really work on grammar schools. I don't look at grammar schools in any great detail. And of course, there is a large educational and sociological literature on grammar schools. So I can, that suggests that what I usually say is something along the lines of, well, whether they're a good thing or not depends what you mean by a good thing. But certainly one thing we can say from the existing literature is they did not aid social mobility. So if you care about grammar schools as a tool of social mobility, we can see that that did not happen. They did not make people more socially mobile. But that is the thing that people seem to latch onto. I think it's their reference point, I guess, for the history of education this period. It's the one thing they know, and so people obviously will ask about what they know. But yeah, it's not something that the book is particularly concerned with, but it is what I'm always asked about.
Yeah, and that's really interesting in and of itself, because it tells us about this narrative people have about the history of education in Britain that actually erases most of what happened to most people who went to like secondary modern schools or comprehensive schools, or just went to like kind of quote unquote a normal school. And yeah, I find that is one of the things that really fascinates me about this work. So kind of picking up on what you said about histories, what's important in histories of childhood, there's been a recent real drift towards people sort of figuring out the impact childhood has on wider social processes, or not the impact childhood, but the impact children have, like on wider political or social processes. And I know you've kind of discussed this and had sort of ambiguous feelings about us sort of making that emphasis. I wonder if you could talk a little about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it obviously is really important to integrate children and adolescents into more mainstream, sort of more sweeping histories. So I have no objection to that. I guess my concern comes, it kind of links to what I just said, I suppose, when there's a sense we only look at children and adolescents when they did something important, or they were important to something that adults were doing, that there's no historical worth in looking at children and adolescents in their own right or what they were doing. And that, I think, is a problem. Historically in some societies and in some societies today, children and adolescents are a significant proportion of the population. They're not a minority group. Well, they're a minority, they technically are a minority, but they are a significant proportion of the population. And I guess what I'm interested in is childhood and adolescence as an experience that is valuable in itself, not an experience that's just valuable in how it shapes future adults. And I think that comes out. So the project I'm going to be working on next is about chronically and terminally ill children in Britain and the US from about 1945, so the same kind of time period. And I'm particularly interested in children who are chronically and terminally ill, because I think this really messes with concepts of childhood, because if a child is terminally ill, they're not going to grow up properly. So what happens then if we think about childhood just as being future orientated, just as about the future adult? And similarly, if a child's chronically ill, yeah, they might grow up, but they're not going to have the kind of adulthood that is, I think we think about adulthood, we think about things like independence and living by yourself and being able to support yourself. There are lots of stereotypical characteristics we associate with adulthood. And so if you're chronically ill, you won't necessarily have that kind of adulthood. So in a sense, you don't grow up, even if you might be chronologically adult, you don't grow up in the same way as other children. So that also messes with our ideas of childhood, even if they are still alive. So yeah, I think that's what I'm really interested in getting at, as to how children and adolescents can be valuable historically. And so, I think it's important to write them into bigger histories, but I'm also interested in children and adolescents unlinked from adult histories.
Yeah, I think I'm also kind of worried about this tendency. We have to prove ourselves to mainstream histories on mainstream history terms, because I don't know about you, but I'm sure all of us as historians of childhood and education have experienced the kind of person from mainstream history who takes up childhood, which is happening more, and kind of, well, nothing's been written that's like actually in any way useful to my work, because it has to fit in with the kind of logic and methods of mainstream histories, which don't apply. Like, that's kind of the fun of doing it, is that you've got to use different methods and techniques and think differently. And I think, yeah, it's interesting, because sometimes I do work kind of like interested in how children affect adult methods of doing things, but there is a kind of danger in only focusing on those things.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I'd like to talk a little bit more about the reception. Was there anything in the reception that really interested you, sort of any reactions or sort of comments or questions that people had that really interested you?
I think certainly when I presented this research, which I've done a lot at conferences and also at job talks quite a lot, I think it's really interesting in how it kind of links back to what we were saying about grammar schools and how that always comes up when people who don't know much about childhood education ask about this book. It makes you realise how, particularly I think in Britain, perhaps in other countries as well, the history of education is still, for a lot of people, it's just about class. So nothing else is important, and obviously class is important in the history of education, as you were saying. It's not unimportant, but that really, if you've got education, people just want to talk about class and social mobility. And I guess I am interested in that. Obviously, I talk about it in the book, but what I'm more interested in as a historian of childhood is how schools act as oppressive institutions for all children, regardless of their class backgrounds. That the only reason they're in school is because they're under a certain age. So it is age that ultimately is the criteria of being in school, not class. If you're working class, you will have probably a different experience in school from a middle class child, and that's important to recognize. But that actually I'm much more interested in age as a category of analysis when I'm looking at schools than class. But often when I present this research, people just want to take it back to class. And that's all they want to talk about, which is a little bit frustrating, because I'm really interested, or gender, actually, gender comes up quite a lot. And again, I can talk about class and gender, of course, in relation to the history of education. There are chapters in the book on class and gender. But I'm interested, I guess, in how age puts children in this position, and actually how age also, because children are, because they're in school, because they're under a certain age, it means that people who are under a certain age are forced into this kind of oppressive situation where actually they also become each other's oppressors, either because they're in a better kind of school than other children, or because they're in a better stream, or because they're the smart kid in school and another kid is badged as like stupid or not good at school, and they end up oppressing each other. But the reason they're in this situation isn't actually because of their class, it's because of their age, because adult people are not in this situation. Does this make sense? So I guess that's what I'm really interested in, and I get frustrated with sort of more traditional, I guess, most sociological texts that are just focused on children's class backgrounds, explaining everything that happens to them in school.
Yeah, it can be like, and also it can kind of obscure, as you said earlier, one of the incredible things is how much time kids spend at school, and to reduce the whole of that experience down to just a pure up or down on the social mobility index, which itself is highly gendered anyway, is really, well, it's just really reductive of what that is.
Yeah. And the other problem is, actually, I just thought of that, if you do well in school and then you get a good job, everyone's like, oh, school was a success for you, wasn't it? It was a good experience. And that doesn't mean it was a good experience. It could have been an absolutely horrific experience. Your achievement is actually could have been totally unrelated to how you actually experienced being in school.
Yeah, and my sister won't thank me for saying this, but she always tells my nephews and nieces she had a wonderful time at school. And then when they ask her about exams, she goes, oh, I was terrible at those, but I loved school.
The opposite is great. Yeah.
That conversely, like, you might have a great time at school that has absolutely nothing to do with education or the classroom. So since you've written this, have your thoughts moved on? Is there anything that you see differently now?
I guess part of what's happened since I've written this is obviously a book that is about childhood rather than the child's voice, and it is deliberately so. So it is about adult concepts of childhood and how those changed rather than children themselves, which I don't think is a problem in itself. But what I have done, I guess, is the other side of this project. So what I've been looking at since is thinking about not specifically schools, but how children and adolescents in this period were a bit later than the period covered by the book, actually, 1945 to 1989, I would say, talk about age, talk about growing up in adulthood, and talk about what it is to be a child, what it is to be a teenager, and how growing up is different and what changes. So I guess what I've been looking at is how children and young people themselves react to the kind of shift in concepts of childhood and adolescence that I talk about in the book. So obviously that's given me new perspective on the book. It hasn't necessarily changed any of the sort of central arguments that I make, but it makes me realize, actually, I guess partly how this psychological language is so deeply embedded in society as early as the 60s, because children and adolescents are using it very adeptly as well. They quite frequently use terms like stage, like life stage, or I'm at a certain stage, or they make these kind of references to chronological age stages that I wasn't really expecting in work from children and adolescents. I'm looking at contemporary essays and contemporary writings by young people, so these are things written at the time. But that has made me think about it, obviously, from the perspective of the students, I suppose, in the book, and how they actually often play into these narratives themselves and perform these narratives for adults.
That's so interesting, though, because as historians of childhood, obviously there's a massive literature on the adult construction of childhood. It's not really been anything on the adolescent construction of adulthood. Like, it's not actually being flipped on its head. But obviously children have to think about adulthood all the time. That's kind of the point of school. Can you give us any kind of brief idea of what they think about adulthood?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's why I wanted to write a history of adulthood, but I was trying to think about who actually thinks about adulthood and who actually engages with social constructions of adulthood. And you're right, it's children and young people more than adults themselves, because they're constantly asked to do it. And actually a lot of the studies they use for this project are essay collections or cohort studies where they've been asked to reflect on things like, what will my life be like when I'm 25, or what will I be like when I'm grown up? So they're being given these by adults explicitly as topics. I would say that they have, because these things are written for adult consumption, because they are either taking part in research projects run by adults or sort of cohort studies run by adults, or they're writing essays in school where teachers are obviously adults. You do very much get a sense of what they think they should be thinking about adulthood. So you get adulthood as sort of very responsible, very dutiful, very self-sacrificing, selfless, and adolescence as kind of irresponsible and selfish and freedom. And there's often quite a sharp dichotomy between, like, when I'm an adolescent, I'll have fun because these are the years to have fun, and then when I'm an adult, I'll have to be completely responsible all the time and I won't have any fun and it'll be awful. So it's quite a bleak picture of adulthood in many ways, but it's not so much that I think this is necessarily what they actually thought adulthood would be like, but it's certainly what they think they should be aspiring to, what they think adults want them to write. And there's also quite an interesting move that a lot of them make, where they basically say, other teenagers are really irresponsible and do X, Y, and Z. I don't do that. So basically, there's a way of moving away from this sort of stigmatized teenage category and positioning themselves more as young adults, as people who are becoming adults already, because they recognize the irresponsibility of their fellow teenagers.
That's really interesting. It's like using the fact that it is a stage with kind of some dynamism and fluidity to it, to kind of, and use that in your own favor of, like, this is a stage I'm moving through, so I can kind of claim to be a step ahead of everybody else.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess this brings us on to kind of one of the last things I'd really like to hear about. So your current project, it sounds like you're talking to young people, and oral testimony also forms, or you're using young people sources, and your previous work also used a kind of real range of sources. And I mean, sources is obviously one of the big discussions that we have in the histories of childhood and in the history of education. I was wondering, did you find it a kind of a challenge to figure out what sources would be useful for the book? And did your ideas about your sources change as you were writing?
Yeah, it's the meeting of kind of two fields that have source issues, isn't it? Because obviously in the history of education, you have like the black box of the classroom and the idea that you can't access historical classroom practice and what actually happened in schools. And then in the history of childhood, you have this idea that children don't leave very many traces in history, so it's difficult to access their experiences. And kind of with this book, I used a very wide eclectic range of sources to try and like not completely contradict those ideas, but I guess challenge them to some extent to say, actually, we can find traces of childhood experience. And obviously, we can't actually know exactly what it was like to be in the classroom in this period, but we can certainly get at real practice in schools more than perhaps people have argued in the past. So yeah, I kind of just traced ideas about childhood through this sort of wide range of sources, sort of from the very top down to the sort of the very bottom up. So, you know, starting with some like psychological texts written by people like Piaget, tracing down to teaching manuals and sort of guides for practicing teachers, and works that I knew were frequently, for example, set in teacher training college courses, so things that teachers are actually reading, sort of wider teaching memoirs, curricula of teacher training college courses, then down to like teaching press, like magazines like Teacher's World and The Teacher that some teachers read in this period. I did use a little bit of oral history work, some archived oral history interviews in the book, and a small number that I conducted myself with retired teachers. There's a little bit of oral history, not huge amounts, and quite a lot more self-narrative stuff. And then for the sort of very local level, I used school logbooks. So the book that the headmaster of the school would have to keep about the sort of day-to-day goings on at the school, which are mostly very boring, but if you look at them across a wide period of time, you can actually see incrementally child-centered education kind of creeping into often very isolated rural schools and some of the local authorities that I was looking at. So just things like the school inspector brought some poster paint today, or the school, or somebody, our desks were removed and we got rid of the fixed desks and we now have tables. And actually that is, you can see in practice, that is child-centered. But the idea of movable furniture rather than fixed desks is child-centered. The idea of having bright classrooms with poster paint is child-centered. So you can see it kind of on a very practical sort of basic level creeping into these schools over the course of the period covered by the book, which is 1918 to 79.
Yeah, it's one of the things I really, really enjoyed about the book is that you're drawings and like it's like, okay, and one of the things I like about history of childhood is like, okay, it is challenging, but that's fine because you can just draw on this vast body and piece together these tiny little fragments that are actually, if you understand it, very meaningful and very important. So your current work on school children, what kind of sources, or your current research that you mentioned, what sources are you going to be working with?
Yep, so my current project is on how children and adolescents understand adulthood from about 1945 to 89. Actually, I've been deliberately restrictive of my sources for this one, and I obviously use contextual material, but my main body of sources are only contemporary writings by children and young people, so only things that are actually written at the time of people under the age of about 21. I deliberately chose to do this. So one obvious way to get this is to use oral history testimony to speak to people about their remembered childhood and adolescence, which I have used in the past and I will use again in the future. But for this project, I didn't want to use it because I wanted to listen to children and adolescents speaking about being young when they were still young. So before they lose that subjectivity that speaking from a certain standpoint gives you. Once you're an adult, I think is it Caroline Steeman that says the child grows up and goes away? It's Caroline Steeman. But I've miscited that. So obviously, I think you can learn a lot from people's memories of their childhoods, but I think that if you want to specifically look at how children and young people think about age, think about growing up and think about adulthood, then you really want to think about it at the time before they become adults, when they're still in that particular subject position. And luckily for this period, there is an absolute wealth of writing produced by children and young people. So obviously I'm lucky in that respect. Obviously this approach would not be possible for many historical periods or places, but there's no shortage of it in Britain. So yeah, that's my main source base.
They're wonderful sources as well. I mean, as you know, I work on children's writing, so I'm a big fan of it as a source. Do you ever get people kind of questioning this as a source? It's something obviously I deal with all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, people often say things like, we've had this conversation before, of course, but often say things like, oh, they're just influenced by adults. They were just writing what adults wanted them to say. So you can't tell anything from that, which is very weird, because actually I'm really interested in what adults wanted them to say, and it's a record of it. So that in itself is useful to me. I don't think that's what children do. I think also children write what they want to write, but even if they were just doing that, that would still be absolutely fascinating. Sometimes people actually question the authenticity of the writing, because a lot of it is very eloquent, and they say, oh, did a kid really write that? Was it edited? And they're not edited sources, but people have a very clear idea in their heads of how children and teenagers write. And of course, how teenagers and children wrote in the past is also different from how they write nowadays, because the generation I'm looking at were being very used to writing a lot more, I think, than perhaps current day children and teenagers are, at least in this format of like long form handwriting. And yes, they question like whether they actually wrote it, or whether they understood what they were writing. I do find it frustrating, because of course you could say the same thing about adult writers, about how they're influenced by what people tell them, or do they understand what they were writing, or are they copying? And adult writers of course are influenced, and they do copy of other people. And so it's really the same set of questions that you have of any kind of written self-narrative source. I don't think there are particular problems of using sources written by children and young people in this respect.
Yeah, I often think it maybe makes me think that the person asking it is too naive in their own handling of their sources, because they don't go in with those kind of questions of, they assume that the person is writing entirely out of their own intent, which isn't the case of anybody at all. And I think it brings us back quite nicely, the idea that children can't write about difficult or complex things, to that idea you talked about earlier, where children are thought to be egotistical and centered on their own immediate tangible experiences of the world, so they can't possibly know literary form or sort of complex phrasing, because it's something that's outside of their reach.
Yeah, it's odd, because we know that children read, and so we should realize that actually children have contact with literary forms and storytelling forms, and they copy them, and like adults do, they copy them and they kind of play with them. It's certainly, if I look at what I wrote when I was a kid, almost all of it is basically copies of Jacqueline Wilson, who obviously I read a lot of as a child. And it's really interesting. Yeah,
that's really fascinating. So I think we can probably finish up soon, Laura, but is there anything that you would like to promote? Are there any other works that you think that our listeners should be looking at?
I'm just finishing up this project on adulthood, which I was funded by the Leverhulme Trust, which is now coming to a close. I've started to publish from this project. So far I've only published one article, I would say, that directly draws on these findings, and it's an article I recently published in Gender and History. I can't remember the full title, but the start of it is "What a difference it was to be a woman and not a teenager," which is a quote from one of my young writers. So that I think is in Gender and History Open Access at the moment. It's not actually an issue, it's in like advanced access, but yeah, so if you want to hear more about my ideas about adulthood and how teenagers wrote about adulthood, particularly teenage girls in this period, then you can check that article out. And yeah, as I say, I'm dotting between projects in this interview, but my future research will be on terminally and chronically ill children and adolescents. So that's the next project, and nothing on that yet, but that's what I'll be doing in future years.
That's so exciting. I'll just read out the full title. It's "What a Difference It Was to Be a Woman and Not a Teenager, Adolescent Girls' Conceptions of Adulthood in 1960s and 1970s Britain," which is in Gender and History. And the title of Laura's book, which we've just been discussing, is "A Progressive Education, How Childhood Changed in Mid-20th-Century English and Welsh Schools," which is from Manchester University Press. Thank you so much, Laura.
No, thank you, Catherine. That was great. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Shusai Podcasts. You can find more materials and features from the Society for the History of Children and Youth online, shcy.org.